Hello and welcome to the Indiana Division of Aging Case Management Online Orientation. This is the section on level of care, general information. Let's begin. To start with, let's talk about what is level of care. And level of care is a term we use to describe the minimum needs that an individual must have in order to be considered eligible for a waiver program. The Aged and Disabled Waiver Program requires what we call nursing facility level of care. This means that it is the exact same eligibility criteria for the Aged and Disabled waiver as there would be for the nursing home pre-admission screening process. So a waiver recipient needs to have the exact same level of needs that someone would have in order to be deemed eligible to enter a nursing facility under Medicaid rules. For our TBI waiver program, we're not going to talk about that a lot today in this presentation. The traumatic brain injury waiver is much smaller in scope than the A&D waiver. A&D waiver serves around 14,000 people statewide, where the traumatic brain injury waiver is capped at 200 people statewide. So it's a much smaller program. I'm sure you'll encounter it at different times, and there are other materials available to help you become more familiar with the eligibility requirements for that waiver. But in short, you can qualify two ways. You can have nursing facility level of care, same as A&D, or you can have what's referred to as ICF ID level of care, which is more related to intellectual disability. It's still an institutional level of care, but it's a different standard than nursing facility level of care. So when we talk about nursing facility level of care, we're basically reaching a decision by looking at a compilation of medical, professional nursing, and non-professional nursing-related, healthcare-related needs of an individual. We're basing that on an assessment of the individual's medical needs, their physical, mental, and cognitive abilities. And the overall goal is determining the level of services that's needed to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of the individual. Nursing facility level of care is defined in Indiana Administrative Code. The citation for that is 460 IAC 131. And there it defines the difference between skilled and intermediate needs. And level of care, basically, you can meet the nursing facility level of care threshold either by having a defined skilled medical need or by having deficiencies in 3 or more activities of daily living. Individuals who have mental health diagnoses or developmental disability diagnoses are subject to some different standards. And the reason we do that is to protect those individuals from inappropriate institutionalization in nursing facilities that cannot provide for the special needs that their conditions warrant. So when we do a pre-admission screening through the local area agencies on aging to determine if someone can enter a nursing facility, we conduct what's referred to as a level 1. And that basically just identifies whether or not an individual does have mental health or developmental disability diagnoses that are at play in that assessment. And if they do, then there's another level of assessment and review that's required, referred to as a level 2 in the pre-admission screening process, to be sure that that person's medical needs are overriding and that the special needs they have can be provided for in the nursing facility. With the waiver program, we don't conduct those level 2 evaluations, in part because the waiver cannot provide those specialized services. The waiver is very defined in terms of what services can be offered, and you can't be on 2 waiver programs at once. So if you're going on the aged and disabled waiver, we're not going to be able to offer you services that might come with one of the waivers through the developmental disabilities division. So when we're evaluating a person with mental health or developmental disability issues, and we see that in the waiver evaluation, we really need to identify a skilled medical need if we're going to determine that that person has nursing facility level of care. So the assessment process and determination of level of care is largely the same whether you're going through pre-admission screening or the waiver process. And it's based on input from an interdisciplinary team that can consist of the physician, nursing, therapists that are involved, of course you as the case manager, as well as input from the individual, their family, or any other persons that they would like to include in the process, particularly those informal supports that might be providing care to them on a regular basis. So within the waiver program, when we talk about when we need to do a level of care determination, basically when anybody is starting the waiver program, we obviously are going to do an initial level of care determination as part of their application process. Waiver eligibility is based on both being financially eligible under the Medicaid rules as well as having a medical nursing facility level of care for eligibility for the aged and disabled waiver. When we're doing those initial level of care determinations, that determination must be made by one of the area agencies on aging. We also have independent case management entities that provide case management services for our waiver recipients. They cannot make the initial level of care determination, though. That must be done by AAA staff. Once that's done, then the individual has freedom of choice in who their case management provider will be. We then reevaluate level of care on a semi-annual basis at a minimum. So that means if you're required, and you are, to make 90-day review visits with waiver recipients, essentially every other 90-day review visit, you're going to be redetermining their level of care. Furthermore, a level of care must also be determined to reestablish waiver level of care if there's been an interruption or termination in the individual's waiver services. This can happen frequently if their needs necessitate a nursing facility placement, even on a short-term basis. At that point, their waiver services have to be interrupted. If they're in the facility for more than 30 days, there has to be an official termination of waiver services. So when they then are ready to discharge from the facility and re-enter the community and resume their waiver services, at that point you need to reestablish that they do in fact still have waiver level of care before you can restart those services. Then beyond that, you're really continuously evaluating for level of care and eligibility every time you see and interact with the person, but certainly at any point where you identify there's been some significant change in their health or their condition. So let's talk for a minute about the documents that are involved with level of care determinations. First of all, we have a form that's called the 450B, and this is the physician certification form. This form provides us with some useful information in terms of the diagnosis of the individual and their prognosis as well. The form can be completed by a physician or a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant. The most important piece off of this form is that the doctor, or again the nurse practitioner or physician's assistant, is signing indicating that it's safe for us to provide home and community-based services to the individual in their own home or a community setting such as an assisted living. That's an important designation for us because we make assurances to CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, that when we provide waiver services to an individual, we're going to do all that we can to ensure their health and safety while we're providing home and community-based services as an alternative to institutional care. So having a medical professional who is familiar with the individual in their case sign a certification form saying that it's safe for us to provide these services to them is a critical piece of the level of care process. Again, you also benefit from having that medical professional identify the diagnosis. Sometimes you'll find that when you first have a conversation with the individual, they may run through a whole list of things when you ask them what their diagnosis or what their medical issues are. Sometimes, particularly as you have conversations with older folks that don't get an opportunity to visit and talk with people a lot, they're more than happy to tell you all about all the impairments and all the aches and pains that they have. They may run through quite a litany of impairments and medical issues that they have, and then you may get a 450B that mentions something like Alzheimer's disease that they didn't mention to you at all. So having the physician complete that form, and there's space on the form to identify up to 3 diagnoses. Many of our individuals are quite ill and impaired and may have a number of things wrong with them. Having the medical professional list for you kind of the top 3 things in their opinion of what the issues are is really useful information in your level of care determination. And again, looking at the prognosis, because we want to find that they have long-term nursing facility level of care. That's what's required for the waiver. We can't have a situation where someone presents with level of care now, but it's anticipated to be short-term in nature. Say, for instance, they've had a fall and broken a hip. They may have nursing facility level of care that is in deficiencies with 3 or more activities of daily living right now, but their prognosis is that they'll regain all of that functioning within, say, a 6 to 8 week period. So that's not long-term nursing facility level of care. So the prognosis is a key piece of information from the 450B as well. Very often as you're getting this form filled out, the physician or their staff in their office may also provide you with a list of medications, and that can be very valuable in the level of care determination process. One last thing about 450Bs before we move on to some other level of care documents is that 450Bs can be very confusing and sometimes downright irritating to physicians to have to fill out. And so it helps you to have some context to that so that you can help them understand why we need this and how important the form is to the process. This 450B form is the same form that's used in the pre-admission screening process for nursing facility placement. So very often doctors are being asked to sign this form specifically saying that it's not safe for the individual to remain in their home or their community, that it's best for them to be placed in a nursing facility. And so you can imagine there might be a situation where they sign that and a person is admitted to the nursing facility and a month or 2 goes by and they now want to come home and start waiver services. And so you very quickly are turning around to the same physician and presenting another 450B and basically saying, hey, this time I need you to sign it and check the other box that it's going to be safe for them to be in the community with waiver services. And so that can be confusing and frustrating for doctors that, like most of us, have way too much paperwork and red tape to deal with. So being understanding of that, explaining to them that you understand their frustration and making sure they're clear on how important this form is, not so much directly with the physician even as with their office manager or the nurse in their office, who very often is the one who's filling out the forms and putting it in front of the physician or the nurse practitioner for a signature. So being aware of that and sensitive to their time demands can be helpful in making sure that you get those 450B forms, as we can't go any further in the level of care process in the end if we don't have the signed 450B. Perhaps the most important document in the level of care process is the eligibility screen. And this is the tool by which we document the nursing facility level of care requirements that are outlined in Indiana Administrative Code as the definition of nursing facility level of care. This is the piece that is recorded in INsite. There are narrative sections that are critically important when the Division of Aging is reviewing for a level of care or reviewing a service plan that is submitted. Page 1 of this document, as it's referred to, is where we identify those skilled medical needs. Page 2 is where we identify deficiencies in what are called ADLs, activities of daily living. There's also a lot of other assessment information related to informal supports, mental health condition, functioning with regard to IADLs, instrumental activities of daily living, that are recorded all within what we call the E-screen, the eligibility screen. So it's very important to remember that that document is not just about eligibility. The name is somewhat misleading because it really is our primary assessment tool. Another level of care document is known as the Form 11. And earlier I mentioned the level 1 in pre-admission screening process. These are essentially the same forms. We call it a level 1 when you're doing pre-admission screening. We call it a Form 11 when we're assessing for waiver level of care. But the purpose is the same in both roles. It's to identify the existence of any mental health or developmental disability diagnoses. When the Form 11 is completed on the first initial level of care determination, it has to be printed and provided to and signed by the waiver recipient or their representative. That only has to happen at the initial level of care determination. Any future level of care determinations, you should fill out the Form 11 information in INsite as part of that new e-screen, but it's not necessary to print it and get the signature. That is only needed once. And again, these are to identify mental health and developmental disability diagnoses, so this is not information that's typically going to change from assessment to assessment. You're going to capture that information early on. And again, the significance of it is that if in a pre-admission screening situation, the existence of mental health or developmental disability diagnosis triggers that level 2 evaluation. For waiver, we don't have that level 2 because we don't have the ability to offer them specialized services for those needs. So if we're going to find nursing facility level of care for those individuals that trigger on the Form 11 as having mental health or developmental disability diagnoses, we are going to have to find a skilled medical need on page 1 of the e-screen in order to find them to have nursing facility level of care. There are some exceptions to that. They can have some new onset diagnoses that may impact that, but that's just the general rule to go by. Your supervisors in your agencies and the Division of Aging waiver specialists will be able to provide additional information and consultation if you have questions when those cases arise. But as a general rule, if they're triggering for those diagnoses on the Form 11, we're going to be looking for a skilled medical need in order to grant them nursing facility level of care. So really quickly on the Form 11, when you do have to present that to the waiver recipient and or their representative on that initial determination, please be careful about how you explain to them the purpose of that form. It can alarm them in some ways because it talks about nursing facility placement, and that after all is what they're trying to avoid with waiver services, so they can be a bit nervous about it. Just explain to them that the reason we're having them sign that form is so that they understand in most cases, once you have nursing facility level of care for the waiver, if you then decide to go into a nursing facility for either a short-term or a long-term stay, there's no additional assessment that has to take place. You just sign a freedom of choice form and you're ready to go, because we've already determined that you have nursing facility level of care. The reason they need to sign the Form 11 is that if they do have mental health or developmental disability diagnoses indicated on that form, that's a trigger in the level 1 for the pre-admission screening process to do that second level of review, the level 2. And so if those individuals should decide to go into a nursing facility, they can't just go. They'll need to allow time for that level 2 assessment to take place before they could be admitted to a nursing facility. So sometimes that takes some special explaining when you first present those documents to a waiver recipient at that initial determination. So just be sensitive of that. This screen depicts what the Form 11 looks like as part of the eligibility screen. And you can see there's just a relatively short list of questions there that will help you to indicate if there are any mental health or developmental disabilities involved with this individual. So let's take a minute to talk about who is making these level of care decisions. And I mentioned earlier that on the initial level of care determination, it must be the Area Agency on Aging, the AAA, that completes that determination. So there is a case manager with the AAA that will complete an assessment, and they'll recommend an approval or a denial of level of care. It is the AAA supervisor then, or waiver liaison, that can review and issue a decision regarding level of care. Non-AAA case managers can make recommendations on non-initial level of care decisions, but the Division of Aging reviews and issues the actual decision on all non-AAA level of care reviews. That being said, even with the Area Agency on Aging decisions, when those plans are eventually submitted to us, an actual service plan, the Division of Aging staff looks at every level of care that comes to us in the form of a service plan request. So we're not only reviewing the appropriateness of services, but we're reviewing level of care as well. And we look at that with every single plan, whether it's an initial, an update, or an annual. We are constantly reviewing to be sure that the individual does in fact appear to be eligible to participate in the waiver program. So once the decision has been made, there is a level of care review form that is issued either by the AAA or the Division of Aging, depending on who's issuing the actual decision. When that form is issued, and it's issued for every decision, whether it's an approval or a denial, the case manager is responsible for providing it to the client or the waiver recipient within 10 business days. The form must be delivered to the individual by either regular mail or email. There are many clients that really need to be hand-delivered that form so that you can help to explain to them what it means. If you want to hand-deliver it to the client, that's perfectly acceptable, but that has to be in addition to sending it to them by regular mail or email within 10 business days of the decision. That is a strict legal requirement within the waiver and federal guidelines. So please be very aware that level of care review forms, just like notice of action decisions, must be provided to the client within those 10 business days after the decision by either regular mail or email. And that is a case manager responsibility. With both the level of care review forms and the notice of action decision forms, appeal rights must be provided as well. And those will print with the forms that are generated out of INsite. Appeal rights must be provided to the client and explain to them, answer any questions. Case managers can assist if they wish to, if the client wishes to file an appeal. That is the end of our discussion about the general information regarding level of care decisions. There are several other level of care presentations that you'll want to take a look at next. The first one will involve the narrative fields, the commentary that you should offer with level of care decisions. And then we will take a look at the skilled needs involved in a level of care decision. That's your page 1 of the eligibility screen. And the final presentation in the level of care series looks at the page 2 activities of daily living assessment, as well as some of the other sections involved in the eligibility screen that are part of the general assessment of the client's needs.